Narrative. What do you think about when I say the word narrative or controlling the narrative? I literally had this word swirling around my mind the last few hours, and I don't know what I want to say about it. And I thought this would be a perfect time to make a video when I don't know what to say and try to compile thoughts and articulate them in a video. When somebody has their thoughts already ironed out and then makes a video, it's kind of like, well, that was rehearsed. But when it's raw, I like that. I like the rawness of seeing the thought process, seeing the troubleshooting, seeing the getting from point A to B to C, and how somebody gets to a conclusion. All right, so controlling the narrative. This is I consider to be a big aspect of society. It's something to where I would say that there has been a certain demographic that seems to have more control of the narrative than another. When I look at, say, the presidents of the United States, and I say, what is the racial demographic of our presidents? And I know we have one black president, and then we have everyone else is Caucasian. Now, when I go through this, I want to express that the narrative itself isn't wrong. I'm not saying because we have a lopsided amount of one demographic leading our country, therefore something's wrong, or therefore they're not doing it correctly. I'm not going down that road, but I do think it's an interesting aspect to consider. What I also think is interesting is let's say that something is wrong about that. Let's say how can a minority demographic, how can anybody outside of Caucasian males be properly represented? How can such uh, leadership over the centuries understand the narrative outside of the narrative that they know? And that can get very, very complicated because let's say that the narrative is the evil. Let's say that because you don't understand the narrative of what other people go through, you're making laws, you're making assumptions and taking an entire country in this direction and completely overlooking the narrative that so many people face. So let's say that there isn't a downside to this. Let's say there's an evil aspect and that's what it is. What I find interesting is that's going to be the case no matter who controls the narrative. No matter what person or entity is controlling the narrative, the one that isn't controlling the narrative is going to be underrepresented. So let's say there is something wrong with only Caucasians being the president so far, except for one black president. Let's say there is something wrong with that. Well, if we get Latino representation in the presidency, if we get more African American representation in the presidency, if we get Asian representation in the presidency, okay, but with each representation in presidency, all that means is that narrative will now be seen. Is there a way that all narratives can be understood? Is there a way that all narratives will get their spotlight, will be will be respected so that everybody knows what everybody's going through? I don't know if that's even worth considering. I don't think that's possible. I remember seeing once an interview of Eva Longoria, and she was advocating or doing activism. I think that might be a harsh way of saying it. She was trying to push for more Latina representation in film, and just trying to express how we need to, as Latinos, we need to be able to control our own narrative, and I think that's a very good conversation to have. I think, especially if somebody feels underrepresented, then sure, that's definitely a conversation worth having. It's just interesting because there's only so much capacity, there's only so much interest that one can have with Hollywood, and there's only so many top hits in Hollywood. And if, let's say, Latinos are getting more represented in Hollywood, that doesn't mean that everybody's going up at the same time. That doesn't mean that all these demographics are getting like, we can't accumulatively raise the bar for representation across everybody. It's like there's a finite amount of representation. There's a finite amount of narrative that can hold the spotlight. So by saying Latinos need more representation, well, there has to you have to take from somewhere else. And I'm not going to say whether or not it's good or bad to take from somewhere else, but I think it's worth thinking about. There's we can't lift everybody up at the same time. So the one who has the spotlight, there's a, how can I say this? The spotlight can only be shown in a finite amount of space. A finite amount of space that can't hold everybody. So whoever gets the spotlight, others are not getting it. And for those others who are not getting it to then push to get the spotlight, you have to push somebody out of the spotlight to get it. I find this very interesting because if the narrative is there's an injustice going on because we're not controlling our own narrative, well, in a way, one can argue it takes an injustice for you to then get your chance, get your shot to push somebody else out of the spotlight so that they are no longer controlling the narrative. You are. I think that's an interesting thought worth thinking about. Controlling the narrative. Another thing I find interesting about controlling the narrative is, let's say you achieve it. Let's say we achieve it and we finally get to control the narrative. All that means is that what we hold to be true is what we educate others to hold to be true. But do we really know what's going on in the world? Do we really know what has happened in history? The culture of each one of these underrepresented communities or demographics, is the culture really that black and white to know that this is exactly what happened in history, and we need people to rally behind to understand what we have gone through, or to understand what it means to be this demographic? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, controlling the narrative, go for it, I'm not going to deny that, but it's a little bit of a futile effort. All it does is pass the baton, pass the spotlight, or as I mentioned earlier, it takes the baton, it takes the spotlight. It can't expand the spotlight. So it's kind of a scary thought that it's a eat or be eaten type of scenario, and it can be kind of scary because, for one, what if somebody takes my spotlight, and then for two is, why doesn't that person deserve the spotlight? There's like conflicting issues here. Well, I think that everybody should feel open and deserves to be heard and to have the spotlight, and to have their narrative be understood. The problem is it could be paradoxical. It could be a futile effort, and it might be solving injustice by inflicting injustice, potentially. I'll leave on that thought. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.